Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Of the many questions facing Pope Leo XIV, one of them is whether to advance the quote-unquote new paradigm for moral theology that was proposed by Pope Francis and some of his advisors in recent years. In 2016, in Chapter 8 of his Apostolic Exhortation Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis proposed the new approach to people in irregular marital situations, second marriages after a civil divorce. Interpretations of this chapter differed widely, and was he recommending situational exceptions to moral norms or a more sympathetic pastoral approach to people who find themselves in these situations? This, again, continues to be an important conversation. I'm joined by Richard Doerflinger. Richard has conducted doctoral studies in theology at the University of Chicago and the Catholic University of America, and served as Associate Director of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' Secretariat of Pro-Life Activities. It's good to speak with you, Richard. How are you?
Thank you. Hi.
I want to begin by asking you to help our listeners understand what the classical paradigm of moral theology is and what this quote-unquote new paradigm was proposing.
Yes, well, the moral tradition of the Church has always said that there are certain acts that, by their nature, are sinful. No circumstance can justify them. To start with, there's the Ten Commandments, including the commandment against adultery. And in two of the Gospels, Jesus is quoted as saying that if you leave your divorce one wife and marry another, you're committing adultery, because from the very beginning, from the book of Genesis, it is God's plan for marriage that it is a permanent commitment. And so, I mean, there are very difficult situations in which people find themselves, in which they have gotten a civil divorce, or maybe they've had it thrust upon them by the other partner. And then they've ended up remarrying. And in part, this is all about whether they can then receive communion or whether they're living in a state of mortal sin that is not consistent with that. What was new about Pope Francis's document, Amoris Laetitia, The Joy of Love, was that he seemed to be saying that if a person decides that the best he can do here and now is to stay with that second spouse, that second partner, and continue conjugal relations with that person, it's the best he can do. And God may be telling him here and now that's the best that can be done. And that struck me as quite new. The Church has always been very careful about believing what seemed to be claimed as private revelations, which is what this would amount to. That rather than say, we want to help you in a pastoral way to correct this immoral situation, and be able to come back to receiving full communion with the Church, they're saying, well, God is telling him, so how can we contradict that? And that seemed to me something, logically, to be almost unlimited in its allowance for sort of situational exceptions to long-held moral norms, some of which come directly from the voice of Jesus. So what I started doing was looking at other things that have come out of the Vatican during Pope Francis's pontificate, and finding that that idea has been advanced by various others, theologians who are connected with the Vatican, including an organization that I belong to, the Pontifical Academy for Life, which published a book about theological ethics of life in 2022. Talking about the turn to the subjective conscience and how that can override the objective moral norms. And Pope Francis himself had said on various occasions that we can't just be repeating old moral principles and applying them to all the concrete circumstances. We need to be looking at the circumstances first and then seeing whether the norms need to have exceptions made to them or whether they need to be set aside or relativized. And that is not what any pope that I've been able to find has ever said. So there's a trend here that seems to be saying we can decide for ourselves whether the moral principles apply to us. And once you say that, the consequences are almost unlimited in principle. There was a group, a synodal group during the synod on synodality, a group of theologians that was appointed by Pope Francis that said we need to be setting aside these abstract principles and living, attending to our living experience, our lived experience, and looking for new directives in the today of the Holy Spirit. Well, if the today of the Holy Spirit is just what you yourself subjectively think is the right thing to do, that pretty much evacuates the whole idea of the Church having objective moral norms that are binding on the faithful. So it's quite a turn. And I've also seen signs that Pope Leo was not enthralled with that approach himself. He is, in recent talks, including talks to the highest tribunal of canon law in the Catholic Church, the Roman Rota, said that, we have to speak truth in charity. We cannot, out of misguided compassion, we cannot be abandoning the objective truth of how bad these situations are. We do need to lead people in a compassionate way toward respecting the moral teaching of the Church, but we can't just say, here and now they're doing the right thing. So I think that is likely to be the corrective to this trend toward just, what Pope Benedict, used to call the dictatorship of relativism, which is, that I get to make the norms for myself based on how sincerely I desire a different solution than what the Church has offered. Also involved in this is what I would call a battle of the books. 4 years ago, the Pontifical Academy for Life put out a book based on a symposium that the leadership of the Academy had put together without the knowledge or consent of any member of the Pontifical Academy of Life who I know, that was called the Theological Ethics of Life and was said to be applying Pope Francis's magisterium to moral theology. And it was all various articles in these proceedings, this book, were all about sort of subjectivizing moral theology, moral teaching, and turning to the individual conscience as the ultimate arbiter of what's right and wrong. To be sure, we've always said, the Church has always said, if your conscience is telling you what the right thing to do is, you need to follow that. You cannot ignore your conscience. But as is also said, it may be an erroneous conscience, and there are other people who know what the teaching of the Church is, whose conscience is telling them to tell you may be mistaken. That's the part that was missing here.
We are talking with Richard Doerflinger, and Richard has conducted doctoral studies in theology at University of Chicago and CUA, and we're talking specifically about a moral movement proposed during the Francis papacy, which was a kind of quote-unquote new paradigm, and whether Pope Leo intends to continue in that vein. Continuing on the other side, stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm talking with Richard Doerflinger about the proposition about a new paradigm for moral theology that utilizes lived experience to reassess the moral treatment, if you will, of individuals in different circumstances of life. Richard, I want to invite you to pick up where you had left off. And for those of you who are just joining us, Richard is specifically referring to the paradigm put forth in Amoris Laetitia about the discernment of moral action and prudence for those who find themselves in irregular marriages, and whether or not Pope Leo desires to continue in that vein. So, Richard, let's pick up where you left off.
Okay, I'm sorry?
Let's pick up where you had left off. So you were just sharing with us that you've seen signs in Pope Leo's statements and his papacy in general that shows that he is redirecting us to look at the objective moral teaching of the Church.
Yeah, just as an example, his talk to the bishops in the Canon Law Commission of the Vatican said, sometimes there is a risk that excessive identification with the oft troubled vicissitudes of the faithful may lead to a dangerous relativization of truth. In fact, misunderstood compassion, even if apparently motivated by pastoral zeal, risks obscuring the necessary dimension of ascertaining the truth proper to the judicial office. And later, and in that same talk, which he delivered in late January, said you're talking about advancing the truth in charity, but the most charitable thing you can do for anybody involved in these difficult situations is to tell them the truth, and is to try to lead them to the truth. And so it is because that's directed to the salvation of their souls. And if you're not telling them the truth, then you are not doing the most charitable thing that anyone can do for another person, which is to point them toward what leads them to eternal life. So it is the truth that is charitable. And that's a very interesting observation, which I think is saying, look, truth and charity go together. It is not that they are at war with each other. In our effort to be compassionate, we cannot abandon the objective truth of the gospel. And that's a theme that was defended a couple of years ago by an independent group of theologians and ethicists, Catholic thinkers, that held a symposium in Rome and then published the proceedings of that in a book called Lived Experience and the Search for Truth, Revisiting Catholic Sexual Morality. And raised a number of points about this emphasis on lived experience. The first was, experience it is the beginning of moral reflection. It raises these problems, these situations that demand a moral answer. But it's reasoned reflection, and for Catholics, reasoned reflection based on the teaching of the Church, that gives the answer to those difficult questions. And that's something that Pope John Paul II, before he became Pope, when he was professor of philosophy and writing his book called The Acting Person, what he said. The second thing is that these 2,000 years of Catholic tradition are based on the lived experience of people at different times and in different cultures faced these problems and ended up developing principles that are capable of addressing those problems. G.K. Chesterton used to talk about the degrading slavery of being a child of one's age, that the Catholic Church is the only thing that saves you from that. That there's a kind of arrogance about thinking that only the people that happen to be walking around right now have experience that is instructive to us. And just looking at sexual morality, can anybody deny that the lived experience of people trying to live up to the sexual revolution has been enormously harmful, especially to women. One of the contributors to this book, Lived Experience in the Search for Truth, Anne Maloney, who's taught moral theology at a Catholic women's college for 30 years, she talks about the depression, the anxiety, sometimes the self-destructive feelings, even the suicidal feelings of young college-age women who were trying to live up to what they thought was the liberation of the sexual revolution, and they can't figure out why they feel so awful. This is lived experience in spades, and it shows that the teaching of the Catholic Church has been verified by experience. I contributed a chapter to this book in which I talked about the experience of my wife and myself with the Church's teaching on family planning, and we ended up deciding that this, somewhat unpopular teaching on contraception and family planning was a great strength to our marriage, and that my wife ended up as a natural family planning instructor. Experience sometimes tells you, wow, the Church was absolutely right. So let's talk about some of those instances where experience and tradition are together.
Now, what this also communicates is not something entirely novel. Modern man has a tremendous sense of historical amnesia, and so there's a bit of pride here in that we don't believe that we owe a debt of wisdom to not just the people of the past, but revelation of the past. Can you please speak to that?
It's the cross is at the center of our faith, and that means that when you follow what Jesus has held up for us as the goal, there is going to be suffering in many cases, and you are not going to be conformed to the world around you. It is a higher calling. And so it's, if what we choose to do in our individual desires is to get rid of the suffering by just deciding we're going to be like everybody else, that's a major departure from what the Christian calling is. So it's something that is at the heart of Catholic moral reflection. Is, are we going to try to live up to this call, or are we going to go our own way whenever following the teaching is difficult? Chesterton's one of my favorite people to quote because he's always so pithy in his conclusions. He said, the Catholic ideal was not tried and found wanting. It was found difficult and never tried. That's a little exaggeration, but this is what we need to be doing is trying to live up to the gospel, and whenever we fall, there is God's mercy and forgiveness to urge us to get up and try again and to pray to him for his grace to have the strength to do it.
The reality of praying for the grace to do it also means accepting that there are parts of my life that I am not living in the way that God has planned morality to work. And so some of that takes hard work, but we all have that moral obligation to do that work.
Yeah, it's when I read Pope Francis's document on marriage, Amoris Laetitia, for the first time, and the whole source of the controversy about the document has been in Chapter 8 about these irregular marital situations. And my first concern was when I was reading the first page of that chapter, and he was talking about situations in which people are not living up or falling short of the objective ideal. And I thought, is that really what we're talking about? I mean, the Catechism of the Catholic Church says that Catholic teaching demands that Catholic marriage is permanent, exclusive, faithful, and open to life. It's not talking about an ideal. It's talking about what we are called to do. If I say to my wife, I have not had sexual relations with anybody else since we got married, so you're living the ideal, I know exactly what she would say to me. I tried this out on her.
You're a man with a death wish.
We're in danger of doing a lot of grade inflation here. Well, if you only had one other wife, it's B plus. And the funny thing is, of course, and here's another instance of lived experience. People have noticed that within the Catholic Church and in other religious institutions, it is the more demanding religious orders, the more demanding and conservative organizations that have actually been growing. And those that want to conform to the culture have been declining.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for your time. I've been talking with Richard Doerflinger about the proposition for a new paradigm of moral theology and why we must be faithful to the Church.